Hello, class. Hope you guys are doing well. Um, let's just get into this. So, this is chapter 7. We're going to be talking about learning. And so, one of nature's most important gifts may be our adaptability, our capacity to learn new behaviors that help us cope with our changing world. We can learn how to build grass huts or snow shelters, submarines or space stations, and thereby adapt to almost any environment. No topic is closer to the heart of psychology than learning. In earlier chapters, we considered infants' learning and the learning of visual perceptions, of a drug's expected effect, and of gender roles. In later chapters, we'll see how learning shapes our thoughts and languages, our motivations and emotions, our personalities and attitudes. In the next chapter, memory, we will see how the brain stores and retrieves learning. And so we're going to talk about classical conditioning, the basic concepts of it. We're going to go into operant conditioning, and then we're going to talk about biological restraints on conditioning. So, what is learning? Is the process of acquiring through experience new information or behaviors. By learning, we humans are able to adapt to our environments. But how do we learn? We we learn to expect and prepare for significant events such as food or pain, which we refer to classical conditioning. We typically learn to repeat events that bring rewards and avoid acts that bring unwanted results, known as operant conditioning. And we learn new behaviors by observing events and watching others. And through language, we learn things we have neither experienced nor observed. We call that cognitive learning. And we will break down each of these types of learning separately, but keep in mind that they rarely work in isolation. So, Ivan Pavlov's name usually rings a bell. Ding, ding, ding. And he laid the foundation for John Watson, who is the leading researcher in behaviorism. So, Watson was influenced by Pavlov, and he felt that the theoretical goal of science of psychology is the prediction and control of behavior. And so, from this was founded the field of behaviorism. And so, his main tenets were that psychology should, one, be an objective science, that two, studies behavior without reference to mental processes. And today, most research psychologists agree with number one, but not with number two. So, Pavlov originally studied the digestive system. He's actually the first Russian Nobel Prize, and his new direction came when he came across an accidental observation. Without fail, he found that putting food in a dog's mouth caused the dog to salivate. Moreover, the dog began salivating not only at the taste of the food, but also at the mere sight of the food, or the food dish, or the person delivering the food. At first, Pavlov considered these quote unquote psychic secretions an annoyance until he realized they pointed to a simple but fundamental form of learning. And so Pavlov's device for recording salivation was a tube in the dog's cheek that collects the saliva, which is measured in a cylinder outside the chamber. And so he wondered if a sight or sound regularly signaled the arrival of food, would the dog learn the link? And if so, would it begin salivating in anticipation of the food? And so, to understand this more clearly, there are some concepts related to classical conditioning that I will go through. So, classical conditioning in general refers to a type of learning in which one learns the link to two or more stimuli and to anticipate events based on those stimuli. The neutral stimulus in classical conditioning is a stimulus that elicits no response before the conditioning. The unconditioned response is an unlearned, naturally occurring response, such as salivation, to an unconditioned stimulus, such as food in the mouth. And An unconditioned stimulus in classical conditioning is a stimulus that unconditionally, which by that I mean naturally and automatically, triggers an automatic response. But salivation in response to the tone, however, is learned. It is conditional upon the dogs associating the tone with the food. Thus, we call this response the conditioned response. A stimulus that used to be neutral, in this case, a previously meaningless tone that now triggers salivation, is the conditioned response. It's the conditioned stimulus. And so let me go through this example. So first, in the upper left corner, um, the dog, the unconditioned stimulus is the food because it produces an unconditioned response in the dog, salivation. In the next slide, or sorry, in the next box, the tuning fork is the neutral stimulus because by itself it elicits no salivation. However, if you continually pair the ringing of the neutral stimulus, in this case the tuning fork, with the unconditioned stimulus, so the food, then after a while, the tuning fork alone, without the food, will also produce salivation in the dog. And so the tuning fork at this point is now the conditioned stimulus, and the salivation response to the tuning fork is the conditioned response. So how much time should elapse between presenting the neutral stimulus, so the tone or a light or a touch, and the unconditioned stimulus, so the food? In most cases, not much. Half a second usually works well. And so what do you suppose would happen if the food, so the unconditioned stimulus, appeared before the tone, the neutral stimulus, rather than after? Would conditioning still occur? Not likely. With but a few exceptions, the conditioning doesn't happen when the neutral stimulus follows the unconditioned stimulus. And so remember that classical conditioning is biologically adaptive because it helps humans and other animals prepare for good or bad events. To deer in the forest, the snapping of a twig, so a conditioned stimulus, may signal a predator's approach, the unconditioned stimulus. If the tone sounded again and again but no food appeared, would the tone still trigger salivation? Well, at this point, something called extinction might happen. And so that's the diminishing of a conditioned response. And that occurs in classical conditioning when an unconditioned stimulus does not follow a conditioned stimulus. But sometimes this thing called spontaneous recovery happens. And that refers to the reappearance after a pause of the extinguished conditioned response. I'll give you guys a kind of like a several seconds to look over this slide. Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit more. Onion breath does not usually produce sexual arousal, but when repeatedly paired with a passionate kiss, it can become a conditioned stimulus and do just that. The larger lesson here is that conditioning helps an animal survive and reproduce by responding to cues that help it gain food, avoid dangers, locate mates, and produce offspring. And so, in this example, higher order conditioning is happening. A new neutral stimulus can become a new conditioned stimulus without the presence of an unconditioned stimulus. All this required is it for it to become associated with the previously conditioned stimulus. For example, I can pair the onion breath with another neutral stimulus, and now that neutral stimulus will become the conditioned stimulus and evoke the conditioned response of sexual arousal. Okay? This is called higher order conditioning. And so this is a idealized curve representing acquisition, extinction, and recovery. And so the rising curve shows the conditioned response rapidly growing stronger as the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus due to repeated pairing with the unconditioned stimulus. It's called acquisition. The conditioned response then weakens rapidly as the conditioned stimulus is presented alone. It's called extinction. After a pause, the weakened conditioned response reappears, and that's called spontaneous recovery. Okay, so generalization is the tendency, once a response has been conditioned, for stimuli similar to the conditioned stimuli to elicit similar responses. So generalization can be adaptive, as when toddlers are taught to fear moving cars, also become afraid of moving trucks and motorcycles. And stimuli similar to naturally disgusting objects will, by association, also evoke some disgust. And so discrimination is the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus, which predicts the unconditioned stimulus, and other irrelevant stimuli. And discrimination, well, they're both adaptive, especially discrimination. So confronted by a guard dog, your heart may race. Confronted by a guide dog, a cute little guide dog, it probably will not race. And so Pavlov demonstrated generalization by attaching miniature vibrators to various parts of a dog's body. After conditioning salivation to stimulation of the thigh, he stimulated other areas, and he found that the closer a stimulated spot was to the dog's thigh, the stronger the conditioned response. And the consensus among psychologists is that classical conditioning is a basic learning form. So many other responses to many other stimuli can be classically conditioned in many other organisms. Virtually all organisms use classical conditioning in order to adapt. And Pavlov was kind of the first psychologist to demonstrate how learning process can be studied objectively. His methods involved virtually no subjective judgments or guesses about what went on in the dog's mind. All we knew was stimulus response, right? If we pair the food with a neutral stimulus, such as a tuning fork, eventually the dog will salivate in response to the neutral stimulus, right? We didn't actually know what's going on inside the dog's head. We just know that we could describe that if we do this, then this happens. And so Pavlov's principles are used to influence human health and well-being. So former drug users often feel craving when they are again in the drug using context with people or places they associate with previous highs. Thus, drug counselors advise addicts to steer clear of people and settings that may trigger these cravings. When a particular taste accompanies a drug that influences immune responses, the taste by itself may come to produce an immune response. And Pavlov's work provided a basis for Watson's ideas that human emotions and behaviors, though biologically influenced, are mainly conditioned responses. Watson and Rayner showed conditioning of specific fears in quote unquote Little Albert experiments. And so a white rat and a frightening noise was paired. After 7 repeats, the 11-month-old cried at the sight of the rat alone. 5 days later, startled fear reaction generalized to the sight of also a rabbit, a dog, and a sealskin coat. And so that's what you'll see if you watch the video, which I can't go through. But there are different stories about what eventually happened to little Albert. One story said that little Albert died in 2007, living a normal life, but feared dogs. Others said he died relatively early. People also wondered what became of Watson. After losing his Johns Hopkins professorship over an affair with Rayner, so his graduate student whom he later got married with, he joined an advertising agency as the company's resident psychologist. There, he used his knowledge of associative learning to conceive many successful advertising campaigns, including one for Maxwell House Coffee that helped make the coffee break, quote unquote, coffee break, an American custom. Okay, so now we're going to go into operant conditioning. And so it's one thing to classically condition a dog to salivate at the sound of a tone or a child to fear moving cars. To teach an elephant to walk on his hind legs or a child to say please, we turn to operant conditioning. So classical conditioning forms associations between stimuli, like a conditioned stimuli, and the unconditioned stimulus signals. It also involves respondent behavior, actions that are automatic responses to a stimulus, such as salivating in response to meat powder and later in response to a tone. In operant conditioning, however, organisms associate their own actions with consequences. So actions followed by reinforcers increase. Those followed by punishments often decrease. And behavior that operates on the environment to produce rewarding or punishing stimuli is called operant behavior. And so B.F. Skinner, so he was an English major, he was an aspiring writer. He wrote a book called Walden 2. He expanded on this scientist Thorndike, his what he called law of effect. And so the law of effect is the idea that rewarded behavior is likely to recur and punished behavior is less likely to recur. And so by shaping pigeons' natural walking and pecking behaviors, for example, Skinner was able to teach them such unpigeon like behaviors as walking in figure eights, playing ping pong, and keeping a missile on course by pecking at a screen target. And Skinner designed an operant chamber, popularly known as the Skinner box. And so the box has a bar or a lever that the animal presses, or a key that an animal pecks in order to release a reward of food or water. It also has a device that records those responses. And this design creates a stage on which rats and other animals act out Skinner's concept of reinforcement. And so everyday behaviors are continually reinforced and shaped. Okay, reinforcement is any event that increases the frequency of a response. What is reinforcing depends on the animal and the conditions. For people, it may be praise, attention, or a paycheck. For hungry and thirsty rats, food and water work well. And punishment is any event that decreases the frequency of a response. So, whereas shaping is gradually guiding toward closer and closer approximations of the desired behavior. So, shaping requires successive approximations and rewards as it approaches a goal. We can even teach a squirrel to water ski. Okay, so in operant conditioning, we have different types of reinforcers. A positive reinforcement increases behaviors by presenting any stimulus that strengthens the response, whereas negative reinforcement, note that negative reinforcement is not punishment. Negative reinforcement increases behavior by stopping or reducing negative stimuli. So is any stimulus that, when removed after a response, strengthens the response. And so, note, negative reinforcement is not punishment because it's leading to a strengthened response. Okay, so sometimes negative and positive reinforcement coincide. Imagine a worried student who, after goofing off and getting a bad grade, studies harder for the next exam. The increased effort may be negatively reinforced by reduced anxiety and positively reinforced by a better grade. Okay, and so these are some examples of each. So an example of positive reinforcement would be petting a dog that comes when you call it, or paying a person who paints your house. Negative reinforcement is removing an aversive stimulus. So when you take painkillers to end pain, um, when you fasten a seatbelt to end loud beeping. Okay, so let's talk about the different types of reinforcers. So getting food when hungry or having a painful headache go away is innately satisfying. These primary reinforcers are unlearned. Um, but conditioned or secondary reinforcers gain power through association with the primary reinforcer. So these are things that can bring you primary um, stimuli, such as money, good grades, pleasant tone of voice, right? Like I can use money to buy food, right? I can use good grade to get a good job, and so I can get money to buy food, right? And these two can become so linked that people were less likely to donate to charity when food deprived, and less likely to share money with fellow participants when in a room with hunger arousing aromas. And so there's this concept of immediate versus delayed. So immediate is when the reinforcer occurs immediately after the behavior, but in delayed type of reinforce, in a delayed type of reinforcer involves a time delayed between the desired response and the delivery of the reward. So if you guys were here in class, I'd ask you some examples of immediate and delayed reinforcers. I'm just going to give those to you. So a paycheck at the end of a week is an example of a delayed reinforcer. Waiting to get good grades at the end of the semester, that's another example of delayed, right? You get a trophy at the end of a season. Um, but, you know, giving a dog a piece of food when it performs a trick, that's an immediate reinforcer, right? And so in most of our examples, um, the desired response has been reinforced every time it occurs, but reinforcement schedules vary. And so we have these different types of schedules. So continuous reinforcement schedule and partial or intermittent reinforcement. And so we're going to go through some of those. So fixed ratio schedules reinforce behavior after a set number of responses. Variable ratio schedules provide reinforcers after a seemingly unpredictable number of responses. Fixed interval schedules reinforce the first response after a fixed time period, whereas variable interval schedules reinforce the first response after varying time intervals. And so, for people, as for pigeons, reinforcement linked um, to number of responses, so a ratio schedule, produces a higher response rate than reinforcement linked to amount of time elapsed or an interval schedule. But the predictability of the reward also matters. An unpredictable, so a variable um, schedule produces more consistent responding than does a predictable fixed schedule. And so these are some examples of reinforcement schedules. So a fixed ratio schedule, that would be like a lunch loyalty card, knowing that after um, such and such amount of sandwiches, you'll get a free sandwich, right? A variable ratio, example variable ratio reinforcement schedule would be playing the slots. You know, you don't know how many times you need to pull that lever, but eventually it will produce a prize. But the rate at which the prize comes is variable. You don't know when it's coming. Fixed interval, that would be getting a paycheck after every 2 weeks or so. The amount of time is fixed, um, but you do have to wait time in order to get that paycheck. And then variable interval, that's when you will get some kind of reward after variable amount of time. You can't predict the amount of time. So a Facebook notification, for example. Okay, so this is just another um, box that summarizes what we went over. You guys can go over it, it'll help you. For the exam, and so reinforcement increases the behavior, punishment does the opposite. A punisher is any consequence that decreases the frequency of a preceding behavior. Okay, and we also have positive punishment. That's when a negative consequence after an undesired behavior is exhibited, making the behavior less likely to happen in the future. And the negative punishment, that's removing a desired stimulus after a particular undesired behavior, resulting in reducing the behavior in the future. Okay, and so here's some examples. Positive punishment, administering something that's undesired. So spray water on a barking dog, give a traffic ticket for speeding. Negative punishment is end something that's desired, like taking away a misbehaving teen's driving privileges or revoking a library card for non-payment of fines. And so if you guys were in class, we'd have large discussion about what do we think about the use of physical punishment in parenting, and it would be very interesting class discussion. And so there are four major drawbacks of physical punishment. Okay, so consider this first example. The child swears, the parent swats, and the parent hears no more swearing and feels the punishment successfully stopped the behavior, which is no wonder that spanking is so popular with so many parents in the United States. But did the punishment effectively end the child swearing, or did the child simply learn that while it's not okay to swear around the house, it's okay to swear elsewhere? 3, a punished child may associate fear not only with the undesirable behavior, but also with the person who delivered the punishment or where it occurred. Thus, children may learn to fear a punishing teacher and try to avoid school or become more anxious. And so for such reasons, most European countries and most US states now ban hitting children in schools and child care institutions. And so 33 countries, including those in Scandinavia, further outlaw hitting by parents, providing children the same legal protection given to spouses. And number 4, studies find that spanked children are at increased risk for aggression themselves. And so we know, for example, that many aggressive delinquents and abusive parents come from abusive families themselves. Okay. So with this, I want you to think to yourself, what is more useful, punishments or reinforcers? And remember, punishments tell you what not to do, whereas reinforcement tells you what to do. Thus, punishment trains a particular sort of morality, one focused on prohibition, what not to do, rather than positive obligations. I'll give you guys several seconds to look at the slide. Okay, and so the predicted Skinner's predicted education revolution did not occur, partly because the early teaching methods often trained rote learning and not deep processing. So golf students can learn putting by starting with very short putts, and then as they build mastery, step back further and further. And parent trained researchers remind us that by saying, get ready for bed, and then caving into protest or defiance, parents reinforce such whining and arguing. So, exasperated, they may then yell or gesture menacingly. And when the child, now frightened, obeys, that reinforces the parent's angry behavior, and over time, a destructive parent child relationship develops. And we can use this operant conditioning in our own lives. So, to reinforce your own desired behavior, perhaps to improve your study habits and distinguish undesired ones, such as stop smoking, for example, psychologists suggest taking these steps. Okay. Um, and so, one really important um, principle is take time to plan. Okay. And so, those who specify how they will implement goals are more often fulfill them. And last, as your new behaviors become habitual, um, give yourself begin to give yourself a mental pat on the back instead of a cookie. Okay, so both classical and operant conditioning are forms of associative learning. They both involve acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination. But these two forms of learning also differ. So, through classical or Pavlovian conditioning, we associate different stimuli we do not control and then we respond automatically, so respondent behaviors. Through operant conditioning, we associate our own behaviors which act in our environment to produce rewarding or punishing stimuli or operant behaviors with their consequences. And so we've learned a lot about the basic processes of learning, but our learning does not only result from environmental influences, but an interaction of biological, psychological, and social cultural influences. And so, well, this is just what I said. There are many influences. So there are these biopsychosocial influences on learning. And so these biological constraints on learning, early learning researchers thought that a behavior could be conditioned using any stimulus the child could perceive, but that turns out not to be true. Humans too seem biologically prepared to learn some associations rather than others. If you become violently ill 4 hours after eating mussels, you'll probably develop an aversion to the taste of mussels, but usually not the sight of the associated restaurant, its plates, the people you were with, or the music you heard there. In contrast, birds, which hunt by sight, appear biologically primed to develop aversions to the sight of tainted food. There are associations between the color red and sexuality. Female primates display red when nearing ovulation. Um, in humans, females' enhanced blood flow produces the red blush of flirtation and sexual excitation. And so Does the frequent pairing of red and sex with Valentine's hearts and red light districts and red lipstick naturally enhance men's attraction to women? Experiments suggest that yes, without men's awareness, it does. Um, and we most easily learn and retain behaviors that reflect our biological predisposition. So, thus, using food as a reinforcer, you could easily condition a hamster to dig or to rear up because these are among the animal's natural food searching behaviors. But you won't be as successful if you use food as a reinforcer washing, to shape face washing or other hamster behaviors that aren't normally associated with food or hunger. And in their dismissal of mentalistic concepts such as consciousness, Pavlov and Watson underestimated the importance of not only biological constraints, but also the effect of cognitive processes such as thoughts, perceptions, and expectations. Um, and so it's as if the animal learns an expectancy, an awareness of how likely that the unconditioned stimulus will occur. So if a shock um, always is preceded by tone, and then may also be preceded by light that accompanies the tone, a rat will react with fear to the tone but not to the light. So although the light is always followed by the shock, it adds no new information. The tone is a better predictor. Um, and so um, People receiving therapy for alcohol use disorder may be given alcohol spiked with a nauseating drug, and then so you wonder, will they then associate alcohol with the sickness? If classical conditioning were merely a matter of stamping in stimulus associations, we might hope so, and to some extent this does occur. However, one's awareness that the nausea is induced by the drug and not the alcohol often weakens the association between drinking alcohol and feeling sick, right? So there's this impact of cognition and cognitive processes that can impede classical conditioning. And the cognitive perspective has also shown us the limits of rewards. Promising people a reward for a task they already enjoy can backfire. Excessive rewards can destroy intrinsic motivation, so the desire to perform behavior effectively and for its own sake. To sense the difference between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation, um, so like behaving in certain ways to gain external rewards or to avoid threats and punishment, that's what extrinsic motivation is. Um, think about your own experience in this course. Are you feeling pressured to finish this reading before deadline? Are you worried about your grade? Are you eager about the credits that will count towards graduation? If yes, then you're extrinsically motivated, as to some extent almost all students must be. But are you also finding the material interesting? Does learning it make you feel more competent? If there were no grade at stake, might you be curious enough to want to learn the material for its own sake? If yes, extrinsic motivation also fuels your efforts. Okay, we can also learn by observation. So, a child who sees a sister burn her fingers on a hot stone learns not to touch it, right? Um, we learn our native languages and various other specific behaviors by observing and imitating others, a process called modeling. A preschool child works on a drawing. An adult in another part of the room builds with tinker toys. As the child watches, the adult gets up and for nearly 10 minutes pounds, kicks, and throws around the room a large inflated Bobo doll. The child is then taken to another room filled with appealing toys. Soon the experimenter returns and tells the child she has decided to save these good toys for other children. She takes the now frustrated child to a third room containing a few toys, including a Bobo doll. Left alone, what does the child do? Well, it beats the hell out of the Bobo doll the same way that he observed the woman doing it. And so notice how the children's actions directly imitate the adults. By watching a model, we experience vicarious reinforcement or vicarious punishment, and we learn to anticipate behavior consequences in situations like those we are observing. We are especially likely to learn from people we perceive as similar to ourselves, as successful or as admirable. So there's a video here for you guys to watch. Um, and so, um, talk a little bit about mirror neurons. So researchers had implanted wires next to a person's motor cortex. So that's in the frontal lobe brain region that enabled the monkey to plan and enact movements. And monitoring device would alert researchers to activity in that region of the monkey's brain. And when the monkey moved a peanut into its mouth, for example, the device would buzz. Then one day, as one of the researchers re-entered the lab with an ice cream cone in hand, the monkey stared at him. As the researcher raised the cone to lick it, the monkey's monitor buzzed, as if the motionless monkey had itself moved. And so, in humans, imitation is pervasive. Our catchphrases, fashions, ceremonies, food, traditions, morals, and fads all spread by one person copying another. And the brain's response to observing others makes emotions contagious. And so, through its neurological echo, our brain simulates and vicariously experiences what we observe. So, the big news from Bandura's studies and the mirror neuron research is that we mentally imitate, and we learn. Models, so in our family or neighborhood or on TV, may have effects, good and bad. Gandhi, Martin Luther King both drew on the power of modeling. So many parents seem to operating according to the principle of do as I say, not as I do. And experiments suggest that children learn to do both. So exposed to a hypocrite, they tend to imitate the hypocrisy by doing what the model did and saying what the model said. And so we also have these antisocial effects when it comes to applications of observational learning. So during their first 18 years, most children in developed countries spend more time watching television than they spend in school. And the average teen watches more than 4 hours a day, while the average adult watches around 3 hours a day. An analysis of more than 3,000 network and cable programs aired during one closely studied year revealed that nearly 6 in 10 feature violence. Nearly 6 in 10 programs featured violence, and 74% of the violence went unpunished. The 58% did not show the victim's pain, that nearly half the incidents involved quote unquote justified violence, and that nearly half involved an attractive perpetrator. And so violence viewing effect has two components. Imitation, so mentally rehearsing and observed behavior increases the likelihood of acting it out, and desensitization, prolonged exposure to violence decreases reactivity to violent stimuli. Okay, we got through that one pretty quickly. If you have any questions about the lecture, please email me. I hope you guys have a great weekend.